Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Step Into the Pivot. We're so happy to have you here again. And today we actually have a return guest, a favorite who many of you may not know is also part of the Step Into the Pivot family, as he does a lot of our editing and stuff. And you've all heard Liam before. He was one of our earliest guests on the show. So, Liam, I'm always happy to see you and have you back.
Thank you, Teresa and Evie. It's great to be here.
And I think this will be a fun conversation. This is a little bit of a different tact for you.
Yeah, so Liam, welcome back. So
Thank
great
you.
to see you here. You have had a recent pivot that is very different than anything that we've talked to you about in the past. And it's also very different than anything that we've talked to any of our other guests so far. So when I saw you step into that pivot recently, I realized that we should have that conversation with Teresa. It's something that Teresa and I have talked about behind the scenes. It's something that's really hot as a topic for a lot of people in financial services industry, retirement industry. So without further ado, tell us about your recent pivot.
I was recently asked to present at a Courageous Being event, which was a live experience exploring how worth, wealth, and wellness shape the way we lead and make decisions. And so I was speaking with other cross-industry experts. So Jessica Taylor, Carolyn Marsh, and J.R. Kuo. So each one of them tackled one of those worth, wealth, and wellness. And then explained how we can apply simple tools to kind of amplify those aspects of our lives. And then I tied it all together by talking about how each one of those kind of differs in how we view them as generations, and then how we can use those tools to better improve our communication and leadership within generations. Does that resonate with you? Does that feel like I gave a
Totally
good?
resonates. Yeah, yeah. We were talking about wisdom and these three concepts, and so much gratitude to Teresa because it was our conversations really that prompted me to start talking about it, like these W's, worth, wealth, and wellness. That conversation has to be had at the same time. Like oftentimes we're talking about one of these topics in isolation, but they are all related. Like, some of the cliches will say health is wealth. And do you remember your inherent worth, regardless of your identity as a leader, a CEO, a leader of a massive enterprise? And then we noticed as we were having these conversations that our interpretations of what worth, wealth, and wellness, what they mean, how they impact us, they'll really vary significantly depending on who you talk to. Is it a millennial, a boomer, an Xer, Gen Z? And just us here working on the pivot, we have a couple different generations working on this project, and we've had to as a team really learn how to work well together because we've noticed like in some of our communication that how Gen Z communicates is different from how Generation X communicates. And that then prompted me to ask Liam, can you help us talk about intergenerational obstacles, challenges, and advantage that comes from generations working together?
What were you really surprised about? What really surprised you as you kind of dove into this a little bit?
I started thinking about them not just as workplace categories, but communities of people that are shaped by different global events. And so then you end up having a different culture within each generation. And so that surprised me because we just don't talk about it like that. So even though it's such a kind of an obvious thing when you think about it, no one talks about generations kind of having their own cultural aspects, but we really do. You can think about certain stereotypes that kind of arise from those without knowing where that truth maybe is coming from. We don't really oftentimes look into like why that is and like say like how did the economic expansion and the opportunities granted from post World War II influence those baby boomers because they were born during that time. So in that talk, I went through and I talked about boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, specifically because those four generations are now at a point where they're all coming together in the workforce, and Gen Z is really shaking things up because like now you have really you know very young people put into leadership positions where they're then in charge of boomers, Gen X, millennials, who are their seniors. And so it's kind of flipping the table there.
I think, though, to be honest, I think some of that has happened across the generations. I think a few things. One is that, like, because I know when I first started, and I'm actually a Gen Xer barely, but I think we were often, we were always very hardworking, and we were that, and because that's what our parents kind of taught us, right? And a lot of times that would happen to us too. But I think the biggest thing, and I'm curious to see what you and Evie think, is, I think what's important to us is what's different, especially when it comes to the workforce and when it comes to that whole worth and wealth conversation. For me, it was like really working hard to really grow my business and da 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 da. And I think, and I'm stereotyping here a little bit, Liam. So you'll have to tell me if I'm wrong. And Evie, I'd be interested in your aspect as well. But I think, like, for you, it's more important, like, to have some time off and time that we never learned, like, that I'm finally just kind of learning now, so that there's just different things that are important to each of those generations too, that impact all the things we're talking about.
So this was what was so cool for me with the research that Liam did, and just thinking about the topic, looking at different articles, looking at different information, talking to people. Why is that? Like, how come there are these general broad categories that we can talk about, but like how come that we have these tendencies, let's say, as generations to feel a certain way. I'm also an Xer barely, but on the other side. So like I was right there with the millennials, and I can sometimes, feel that fluidity between the generations, but still, when we talk about this sense of, like, for Generation X, like something that I really identify with is this, like, the grit of, like, well, I don't know if it's really all about the money, but whatever it is, I have to, like, figure it out on my own. And there's a certain resilience, that kind of like comes
Yeah, and
stereotypically
then
speaking with
and to
our
me,
generation.
yeah, those Gen Xers are about adaptability, right? We can
Yeah.
adapt wherever that wants to be, whereas the millennials are a little more kind of very purposeful, but still want to be flexible, right? And that's a distinction in my mind, right? Like
Yeah.
totally
And
true, and
here's
that's why we veer on those
totally.
different ends.
And here we are speaking, we're doing it. Like you and I are doing it right now. We are biased and we are talking about it from our own, just like
Yeah,
viewpoint. And let's own it. Let's own the
yeah.
stereotypes and the bias. And Liam, can you tell us more about like what you found basically behind the scenes from research that is out there? Because there is a lot of really excellent research
Mhm.
that's happening. What are some of the key highlights that you found in terms of like, tell us about the generations that are older than Gen Z? So you already started talking about how there's some pivotal seminal events that happen during formative times of, when a person of a particular generation is growing up and, really coming to their sense of self. What are some of these main events?
Yeah, I'll go into that. And I just want to touch on what you were both saying, where I think that broadly speaking, it's almost helpful to think of it like a language between generations. So, like, we're all maybe speaking in different dialects of the same language. And then it can get really confusing. Are we saying the same thing? Do we actually, like, are we able to communicate? I kind of understand what you're saying, but not really. The fundamentals can stay the same or very similar. Like Gen Z also cares deeply about excellence in work and our contribution to that. Like we don't want to just sit on the sideline. It's just we're talking about it in a different way. And so we are wondering if how we're measuring that value, if that needs to change now. And Gen Z specifically, I'm proper Gen Z, 2003. And it's not that other generations aren't going through what we are experiencing. Like everybody had COVID as a pandemic, right? But for Gen Z, that was going on during our formative years. I mean, people were like in high school trying to get college or getting out of college, getting jobs when COVID was happening. And that impacted our social ability to create relationships and continue growing with them, and everything's online, and you have Zoom meetings, and each generation has those kinds of experiences during their formative years. So like baby boomers, they had the economic expansion and the post World War II optimism, like I was saying, but there was also a lot of Cold War tensions, anxiety, and kind of mistrust about government. And so then you can kind of see how that goes into both loyalty and work, but it's like working for oneself is important, and how that then plays into how they interact with other generations. And then for Gen X, like you guys had economic uncertainty and the internet transition. You were there for each half of it, like before and after, which means that you maybe understand the foundations of how some of this, like technology, yes, but also just like some of how the world works, even if you don't understand the exact way it does now. You know the baseline for it. And then you guys also had a ton of corporate downsizing. I had the research for it, but it was like during the 70s and 80s, like I don't even remember how many million, like tens of millions of people lost their jobs. Um, and then that led into the economic recession, which is when millennials were born. And then there was global instability. There was like 9/11 during their time, and the rise of social media. So they were kind of brought into the world at a very kind of disruptive time. You start to see that kind of like why are we doing what we're doing? That kind of like shift in looking for purpose. And then Gen Z comes along, and then we have like economic instability, COVID pandemic, housing concerns, climate change, AI innovation. There's casual conversations about World War III. There's information overload because everything's so accessible nowadays. There's a loneliness epidemic tied in with social media. And then, like especially in the US, you have a ton of violence and school shootings and political polarization, which is causing a lot of tension. And so all of the other generations are going through that as well. But this is the stuff that we're growing up in.
And also a comment here, we are talking about the United States in particular. And, from a global perspective, some of this
Yeah.
applies elsewhere, but we're particularly discussing, what this has been like in North America and the United States in particular.
Yeah, definitely in the US, and is particularly what we're talking about. But a lot of this stuff can be applied elsewhere, where even if it's not these specific events, there are these events that different generations are born into.
Can you talk about the conflict then that happens between generations in the workplace because of these, differences in terms of upbringing and understanding of the world?
Yeah. Um,
I love Liam's relaxation about this because he knows like it's
I
even
know.
easier
He
for me
knows
to
that he can
like
take
cut
out.
well,
out
I'm gonna cut it
chicken
anyway.
and
I'm
make it
like,
this is gonna be
yeah,
so great.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
maybe I can do my favorite bit. There's this Amy Poehler joke that I love, Teresa. She has this stand-up thing about generations. If you've heard it,
I have not heard it.
it goes like this. Let me see if I can do it. Um, Boomers are, it's all about the money. Gen X is it all about the money? Millennials are like, where is the money? And Gen Z is, what is money? So
It's
I
fair.
love it. I think for me, it does summarize some of this like essence of it. And then Liam and I had a discussion about how that is something that's really funny to an Xer, but it's not really funny to Gen Z.
Right. Right.
But I love it. So
Yeah. Yeah, but I would love for you to circle back and talk about that conflict in the workplace because that's I think gonna tie this together.
A lot of it stems from making assumptions, and like stereotypes, like I said. So like the example that I used in the talk is like you can make an observation about someone, and then based on their age or their generation, that again you might be guessing, you will then make an assumption about why they're doing what they're doing. So I said, if you see someone who's drinking a lot of coffee and looks kind of tired, you can say like, look how much coffee this person's had. Like they were probably working all night, and they have no sense of time management, and they probably, are not focused on their family enough. if they're like an older generation. But if they're younger, you're going to assume like, oh, look at them. Like they were probably playing video games all night, not on their phone and just scrolling on TikTok. When it like the truth could be that they're just like a 30-year-old person who's like working a normal amount of time, didn't sleep so well. And, like that's it. Like you have no idea. But we start making these stories because our brains are taking the limited information we have and like someone's age, and we just start creating the explanations.
I think it's a fair comment, right? We do that a lot about people in general, but I think in the workplace, I think you're absolutely right. That it becomes much more stereotyped, I guess is the word that I would probably use there.
As soon as you said that, I was like, that's how a lot of workforces are designed, right? Because we reduce people to these labels,
Yep.
and we're like, okay, you are in charge of this. This is your title. This
Yep.
means you have this much value determined by your salary. And so then in our social interactions, we do the same thing and we reduce them to their labels that we assign them. And we just assume we already know who they are, like what they value and how they work, when that's not really true. And I think Gen Z is now watching that. We've seen that all over the place with, especially growing up with like the information overload, like I was saying. And then you have all these people coming out like as not who you thought they were, good or bad. And you're really having the breakthrough of like people are not these labels that we're assigning them. So is this the best way to measure value?
I'm thinking about some of our original episodes of Step into the Pivot, where you kicked it off with the conversation around how when you sold your business and you started being public about that, people were like, okay, Teresa's retired. And they
Yep.
just
She's done.
decided, they started making assumptions based on your age and the activity that you shared about. And then you were saying, no, I'm still here. I have a relationship with work. I have a lot to contribute, and it's going to look different than what it looked like recently, but I'm figuring it out. And, you just like basically started pushing these definitions. And then, same thing, with many of our guests who would come and share, listen, I'm ready to talk about something that my peers, my colleagues don't know. Here's this thing that happened to our family recently, and you guys thought that I was just kind of like, I don't know, that I was irritated at the project we were working on. No, it's my brother committed suicide.
Yeah.
Like we had a guest who talked about that. We had a guest who said like, no, I wasn't just like bitchy. I had breast cancer that you didn't know about. And many, many, many tough conversations like that. So
So
I
now
think Liam,
imagine growing up, right? You're growing up and the people that you care about and are working are experiencing that. And you're watching thousands of people on social media, I mean, millions of people going through that. And so then, and now you're coming into that workforce and you're like, okay, I'm gonna maybe start looking at this with a different lens.
yeah.
Again, this is my opinion, and generally, like not
No.
everybody does that, but
And I think you're totally right. Like I think you are. And I think a lot of that becomes because there's a lot more information out there, which is good and bad, right? I always say it all the time. I'm really glad I didn't grow up in a time where there were cell phones and people could take videos of what was going on, right? Like there's a difference in the world, and you kind of started this way, Liam, right? Like that there's a difference in from a technology standpoint, which is going to totally change kind of what's happening. So how do we get past that? How does my generation, and I'm gonna leave Evie alone because she's at the lower end of that, but how do I work with Gen Z? Because the truth of the matter is you're the group that's coming into the workforce. You're the group we need. You're the group we need to mentor and make sure has the resources they need to succeed as you want to succeed. And we're not going to succeed without your group, right? Like we all need to work together. So how do we work better with you? I have my ideas, but I want to hear yours first.
this has been researched numerous times, and we know it inherently that we all, organizations, companies, but people, when they collaborate, and when leaders intentionally bridge different groups, um, they are more successful and cooperative, and that leads to better results. Um, so when you have leaders that allow generations to do that instead of keeping them in their separate worlds, kind of like that's the IT department. You don't need to know what they do because you're just selling the product and they're making sure it works. But it's kind of like the more I know about what each team does, the better I'm going to be at doing my job. Um, but that's the kind of the older model of doing things, is keeping them separate. So that's one thing that we can do.
Well, I'm going to
Um,
stop you before you go there. I was going to say exactly the same thing. So I love that
yeah,
we are actually on the same wavelength. That I agree that me getting to know you and how you want to learn and what you want to learn, and actually having a conversation with you helps me as a leader, but it also helps you. Right? It has to go both ways. So I was actually going to say something very similar. So I love that. Okay, so go on to your
that's
second
great.
point. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's great.
totally. The other thing I said is we can be explicit about workplace expectations. I think that's a big one, because there's an assumption that everyone kind of defines success the same way, um, but we don't. Um, like our values can be the same, but we might interpret like how we measure them differently. And so like I might have an argument with my Gen X boss and be like, what does it matter that I'm here for 6 hours when I got the project you asked me to do done in two? Like, do you want me to just sit here for 4 hours, or like, can I actually move on to something else, or go home? Like, you asked me to complete it and I did it. So
That's
I think just being like very clear about like, okay, here, when you're here, you need to stay here for this amount of time and be busy for this amount of time. Or this is a project-oriented company. So once you get your work done, you're free to leave. Um, I think that that's important, and creating that shared goal that we aspire to as a group instead of just continuing to operate on an individual growth mindset is very important in doing that, and kind of teaching Gen Z this is the purpose of like why we do what we do. Um, because like the financial industry, for example, they do that, but they don't do a good job of telling the story of that. Like helping someone transition from the loss of a loved one, and then there's money moving around, or they're transitioning to retirement. That's a very important, purposeful job and like position of power as the one helping that person. But it's not really talked about in that way. It's kind of talked about just in terms of the numbers of it, which doesn't feel as satisfying to a new generation that's looking for something to do that's important and empowering.
I really think your definition of success really struck a tone with me, because right, like we all have different definitions of success. We all have different definitions of what wealth means. We all have different. I used this example, and Evie's probably heard this before, right? My father-in-law has no real money, but when we moved him, he was basically a hoarder, and his wealth was the stuff he had. That was what it was about for him. Now, in my mind, that was crazy. Why did you buy all this stuff when if you had the money from buying all that stuff, you'd have money and wealth, right? Like, but it,
Right.
we have to think that through, right? What the success looks like, what the wealth looks like, what the work environment looks like. You covered all of those, but and it's totally true.
I love that. I love what you said about wealth being different, and worth and wellness. I feel like all three of those, and maybe you can expand on that, Evie, but like all three of those can be interpreted differently. And so it's like, one generation might be like, I need more stuff. Like that is how I'm measuring my wealth. But then another generation is like, well, I want the actual money because that brings me freedom and I can do things with it. But then another generation is like, well, what's the point of all that money if you can't do anything with it because you don't have the time to do anything with it? And then another generation is like, well, none of that matters because now it's all Bitcoin and nobody has cash anymore.
But
And so like I think that plays
yeah,
into your joke, your
no.
Amy Poehler joke.
And that can vary though too based on the person. Like it's not even
Sure.
really just generation. It really can vary based on the person too. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I think
yeah,
we just see it grouped more
for
in
sure,
generations, but
for
you're
sure,
absolutely right. Yeah.
totally right. So you're learning. You learned this. You did all this research, which I love. How do you think it affected how you're going to think? I guess is what I would be curious about. But think about you as you're going to join the workforce, right? How is knowing some of this going to help you with that moving forward?
How was this what? A step forward? What?
Yeah, how is this pivot?
That's a great question. As I'm moving into the workforce, I am understanding that there is a need for kind of the storytelling of like, this is what we do, this is why it's important, this is how we can change in a growing world, in a growing work environment, to better suit changing clients, as people are growing up, and also changing workers. Yeah, I'm just kind of more aware of that as a whole, and getting my name out there next to these other very like established speakers, and working closely with Evie on Courageous Being has been a huge opportunity and advantage that I just want to keep taking advantage of, and helping out and showing up and being like, Gen Z is here to work. We are here to get things done. It's just a little differently. And hopefully I can leave a good impression for everyone else.
Well, you brought that up, right? Like, as long as we get it done and get to that end result, does it matter that I would have done it differently than you did it, than Evie did it? No, it probably does not, right? Like, and so, I think that kind of bring it all together very nicely, Liam. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to speak with you both again. This is awesome to see how the podcast has grown. So super cool to be invited again.
One big shout out to you, Liam, for stepping also into the pivot when it comes to public speaking. You did public speak in the past, you've presented things, but this was very different having seen you do it because it was, like you said, uh, a group of leaders and executives across professions that you didn't know. So a lot of strangers, and you were the last one who spoke. I'm curious if you can also tell us how was this pivot a step forward for you, just from the perspective that you did something that was uncomfortable and you chose to do it. Does that have something to do with that whole purpose? And as a Gen Z that you, I don't know, was it important to you from a I think this matters perspective, or was there something else that it encouraged you to say, I will do it, even though it's something that requires me to really stretch and, lean into my growing edge?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's something I was definitely nervous for. Um, but it's kind of fun, like to feel that nervousness when you have people who are supporting you. Um, and like just in that talk alone, like I had a bunch of different people. I was the youngest person presenting. We had a bunch of people, working, help us set up, and then the other speakers were there and you were there. And so you had a bunch of different generations also kind of helping bring me in to that. And that was kind of like that from the get-go. So it was exciting to know that I had the support, which was helpful. And then the purpose of it, I really wouldn't have done it if I felt like this is going nowhere. But you created the stage, the platform for me to speak on an issue that I think is important for, for myself and others. And you had a lot of people voicing interest for it, which made me feel like, okay, this is why I'm doing this, is because these people want to hear more about it. And there's a possibility for me to be the channel for it right now. So, um, yeah,
This was really important for me that we talk about because of that question that you asked him earlier, Teresa. And I am very much thinking concretely about, retirement services. How can we attract more people? And what can we do better from a recruiting standpoint and also in interviews? And then with the folks who are already in the workforce, like how can we keep motivating them? I think Liam, you just gave us a concrete example of what that's like. And I think like you were saying before, our industry is so purposeful, but we are not yet talking about it really with that, the level of conviction that I think that these younger generations will need to really be, interested in saying a wholehearted yes.
In success and being successful,
Yeah,
whatever that means to them.
exactly.
I mean, we're back to that, whatever that means to them, right? I think that there's a lot of tidbits in here that we can take from it, but it's going to be a continual discussion. It's going to continue to grow and to change, and but we need to communicate and work together, and and make sure that we all have what we need to be successful. So I think it's amazing. So thank you so much, Liam. Love having you here. Love getting to see you. Usually I just get to email with you, so seeing you live and in person is always great. So thank you so much. Thank you also to our listeners today. We always love having you here. So we will sign off for a couple weeks, but remember, if you have a pivot, step into it.